Welcome, listeners. Settle in, turn the lights down low, and take a deep breath. There is a universal contract we all sign when we lock our front doors at night. We turn the deadbolt, slide the chain into place, and draw the blinds. In doing so, we tell ourselves a comforting lie that the wood, the glass, and the metal are enough to keep the chaotic, unpredictable world on the outside. Our home is our sanctuary. The front door is the absolute boundary between safety and the unknown. But what happens when the unknown comes right up to that boundary? What happens when a stranger stands on your porch, raises a fist, and shatters your illusion of safety with a simple, heavy knock? Tonight, we have for true stories, for terrifying reminders that sometimes the monsters don't hide under the bed. Sometimes they walk right up to the front step and ask to be let in. Our first journey into the dark takes us to a quiet, isolated dead-end street just outside of a small town. Our narrator was a freelance graphic designer, a professional whose entire life revolved around the glow of a computer monitor, in a lonely, one-story rental house. Because of the nature of his work, he rarely left the property. His groceries were his only excuse to venture out. His friends knew his habits. They never simply dropped by without a text message first. He lived in a cocoon of predictable, quiet isolation. There were only 5 houses on this entire street. There was no through traffic, no accidental wanderers. Understanding this layout is crucial, because it means that anyone who came down this road came down it with a specific purpose. It was a Thursday evening, around 8:45 p.m. The house was bathed in the flickering, artificial light of a television. Out of nowhere, the heavy, muffled silence of the house was broken by 4 sharp, authoritative knocks at the front door. Our narrator froze. He hit the mute button on the remote, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. He sat perfectly still, trying to convince himself that it was just the house settling, or a sound from the television. But then came 2 more knocks. Firm, demanding. He rose from the couch and crept softly to the entryway, pressing his eye against the small glass peephole in the center of the heavy wooden door. Standing under the dim amber glow of the porch light was a man. He appeared completely unremarkable, somewhere in his mid-30s, wearing a dark, heavy jacket and a standard baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Cradled in his arms was a medium-sized, unmarked cardboard box, keeping the heavy metal chain securely fastened. Our narrator cracked the door open a few inches. But the man didn't miss a beat. He immediately stated he had a delivery that required a physical signature. He held up a small, electronic handheld device and rattled off a name. It wasn't our narrator's name. In fact, it wasn't even close. "You have the wrong address," our narrator said, his voice steady but cautious. The man didn't apologize. He didn't turn around. Instead, he looked down at the cardboard box, then deliberately looked at the digital scanner in his hand, and finally raised his eyes to stare directly through the crack in the door. He slowly read the address aloud. It was the exact, correct address of the rental house. A cold trickle of unease washed over the narrator. "Light. No one by that name lives here," he repeated, firmer this time. The man just stared. The silence stretched for a full, agonizing second, longer than any normal social interaction would allow. His eyes were cold, calculating. Finally, the man blinked, muttered that he must have been handed the wrong dispatch information, and claimed he was going to take the package back to his truck. Our narrator watched through the crack as the man pivoted and walked down the concrete driveway. But as his eye scanned the dark street beyond the property line, a terrifying realization set in. There was no delivery van. There was no idling car. There were no headlights cutting through the dark. The man simply walked past the mailbox, turned the corner at the end of the dead-end street, and vanished into the shadows. Our narrator quickly slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt and locking every mechanism. He spent the rest of the night feeding himself rationalizations. It was just an independent contractor. He parked on the main road. It was a simple mistake. The very next night, the illusion of a mistake was violently shattered. It was Friday. Almost exactly 8:45 p.m. 3 solid knocks echoed through the living room. This time, there was no hesitation. The narrator practically glided to the peephole. It was the exact same man. The exact same dark jacket. The exact same cardboard box. Our narrator didn't even touch the doorknob. He simply leaned close to the wood and called out, telling the man that he had already been there, and that the person he was looking for did not exist in this house. Silence hung on the other side of the door. Then, the man's voice filtered through the wood. He insisted, his tone flattened emotionals, that the system mandated the package be delivered tonight. He just needed a signature. Any signature. "I'm not signing for someone I don't know," the narrator shot back. Another long, heavy pause. Finally, the man simply said, "Okay," and took a step back. But he didn't leave. Our narrator kept his eye glued to the peephole, his breath caught in his throat. The stranger stood at the very edge of the porch, perfectly still, his back straight. Slowly, mechanically, the man turned his head to stare directly into the front living room windows. Then his gaze swept toward the darkened side of the house. He was analyzing the property, assessing the vulnerabilities. Finally, after 15 agonizing seconds of silent observation, he turned and walked down the driveway. Light. Again. No vehicle. No engine sound. Just a predator retreating into the dark. By Saturday, the third night, the tension inside the house was suffocating. The narrator waited, watching the clock tick past 8:45. But the night remained silent. No knock came. A wave of profound, exhausting relief washed over him. He even chuckled to himself, mocking his own paranoia. He thought the game was over. He was wrong. Sunday night. 9:0 p.m. The narrator was standing at his kitchen sink, the warm water running over his hands as he washed dishes. The house was quiet. Knock, knock. Knock, knock. Light, knock, knock. He froze, the sponge dropping from his soapy hands. The sound hadn't come from the front door. It had come from the side of the house, directly against the glass of the dining room window. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wiped his hands on a towel and crept into the dining room, his eyes straining against the darkness outside the glass. Nothing. The yard was empty. And then, for heavy knocks erupted from the front door. He scrambled to the entryway and pressed his eye to the peephole. It was him. But the prop was gone. The man was no longer holding a cardboard box. His hands hung empty by his sides. Our narrator held his breath, making absolutely no sound. The man knocked again, louder this time. When there was no response, the stranger took a slow step backward and looked dead center into the peephole. It was as if he knew someone was standing just millimeters away, on the other side. Our narrator practically threw himself backward, terrified that a shifting shadow or a creaking floorboard would give him away. 30 seconds crawled by. Finally, the man turned and melted away into the night. The narrator waited 5 full, excruciating minutes before he dared to move. Keeping every single light in the house switched off, he crawled from room to room, parting the window blinds just a fraction of an inch to peer outside. He found him. Directly across the street, standing perfectly still at the edge of the dense tree line, was the man. He wasn't walking away. He was just standing in the absolute dark, staring unblinkingly at the rental house. A minute passed like an hour before the silhouette finally turned and vanished into the woods. Monday morning brought a desperate call to the police on emergency line. The dispatcher's words offered no comfort. They explained that this was classic predatory behavior. Burglars frequently use the guise of a delivery to verify occupancy. If someone answers, they play dumb and leave. If no one answers, they know the house is ripe for the picking. The officer advised him to keep the lights off, stay hidden, and call 911 the absolute second the man returned. That night, the house was a tomb. The narrator sat in the pitch-black bedroom, staring at his phone screen. 8:45 p.m., right on schedule. For knocks at the front door. The narrator didn't move a muscle. A few seconds passed. For more knocks. Then, dead silence. But the silence was a lie. A minute later, a soft, heavy thud echoed from the back of the house. Someone was physically testing the integrity of the back door. Our narrator grabbed his phone and crept barefoot into the darkened hallway. As he approached the kitchen, the blood drained from his face. He could hear the metallic, deliberate sound of the back door knob slowly turning to the right, hitting the lock, stopping, and turning again. He dialed 911, pressing the phone to his ear, whispering frantically into the receiver that an intruder was actively trying to breach his home. As the dispatcher calmly assured him that patrol cars were screaming toward his location, the front door erupted in frantic knocking. The narrator's mind spun in terror. The front door is knocking, but the back doorknob is still turning. There was more than one person outside. He was surrounded. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the dark. The sickening, high-pitched scrape of metal digging into wood did. They were slipping a pry bar into the doorframe. When you wedge metal against a strike plate like this, you are trying to pick a lock. You are applying brute, physical leverage to completely shatter the wooden door frame and violently burst into the home. For 30 seconds, the scraping continued, the wood groaning under the pressure. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The night went dead silent. The narrator stayed on the line, clutching the phone in the dark, until the sweeping red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated his living room through the blinds. When the officers conducted their perimeter search, the reality of how close he had come to a violent home invasion became undeniable. Gouged deeply into the wood, near the back door handle were fresh, aggressive pry marks. The officer looked the narrator in the eye and told him a chilling truth. If you hadn't been home to lock the deadbolts and keep the interior dark, they would have kicked this door off its hinges tonight. The police scoured the neighborhood, but the phantoms had already slipped away. The following night, the narrator packed a bag and fled across town to stay at his brother's apartment. He didn't post about his absence on social media. He just vanished. At 9:00 p.m., his cell phone lit up. It was his neighbor, an older woman who lived 2 houses down. Her voice was trembling. "There's a man standing on your porch," she whispered. "He's been knocking relentlessly for 5 minutes. The narrator asked the crucial question, "Is there a delivery truck?" "No," she replied. "There's no vehicle at all." He instructed her to call the police immediately. The patrol cars arrived fast enough to catch him still standing on the porch. Later that night, the police called the narrator with an update. They had detained the man. He was wearing the dark jacket and the baseball cap. When questioned, the man played the victim perfectly. He claimed he was simply an independent courier trying to deliver a misplaced package. He had no corporatid. He had no marked vehicle. Without a warrant or a crime committed in their presence, the police could only issue a stern criminal trespass warning and tell him to leave the area. But a predator's hunger is rarely satisfied by a warning. 2 days later, the same man was arrested in a neighboring subdivision. He was caught red-handed, violently attempting to pry open the back door of a house where the homeowners had left for vacation. When the detectives searched his personal vehicle parked blocks away, they found the tools of his terrifying trade: multiple flattened, empty cardboard boxes, and a cheap electronic barcode scanner that wasn't connected to any network on Earth. During the grueling interrogation, the man finally confessed to his methodology. It was a dark, psychological algorithm. He would knock with the fake package to catalog who lived where. If a resident answered, he would apologize, leave, and mark the house as occupied. But if no one answered, he wouldn't just break it immediately. He was meticulous. He would return, night after night, knocking at different times, watching the lights, looking for a break in the pattern. If a house was dark one night, lit the next, and dark again, he assumed it was empty and would signal his crew to for sentry. Hearing this confession sent a cold shudder down our narrator's spine. He realized how razor-thin the margin of his survival had been. If he had simply ignored the door on that very first Thursday night, assuming it was a salesperson and staying quiet on the couch, the man would have flagged the house as empty. He would have come back later that night with the pry bar, expecting to find an empty home. Instead, he would have found the narrator. 3 months later, the moment the lease expired, the narrator packed his life into boxes and left that dead-end street forever. To this day, when the sun goes down, his door remains locked. If an unexpected knock rattles the wood, he doesn't speak. He doesn't move. He simply checks the cameras. And if a man ever stands on his porch with a package bearing his address but the wrong name, he knows better than to ever open that door. Take a breath, listeners. Our next story moves us across the Atlantic to the bitter, freezing winters of Scotland. Imagine the scene. It's the thick of December, just days before Christmas. Our narrator is 16 years old, living in a bustling, incredibly close-knit household near the vibrant city of Glasgow. The house is always full of life, parents, multiple siblings, cats darting across the floor, and dogs curled up by the radiators. The Scottish winters are famously brutal, driving families indoors to seek warmth. Their nights were usually spent packed into the cozy living room, drinking tea, catching up on the day, and watching television. On this particular evening, the warm glow of the screen was playing a classic, A Christmas Carol. Right in the middle of a scene, a sharp knock hit the heavy front door. It was particularly alarming. In a house of that size, visitors were common. The mother casually pushed herself off the sofa, walked into the hallway, and pulled the door open to the freezing night air. The porch was empty. The street lamps cast long, lonely shadows across the pavement. There wasn't a soul in sight. Their property featured a garden that wrapped completely from the front yard around to the back, offering plenty of hiding spots. She stepped out into the cold, peering down the dark side of the house, looking for giggling teenagers. But there was only the biting wind. Puzzled, she shut the door, locked it, and returned to the movie. A few days later, the house was quieter. The narrator was sitting alone at the living room table, buried in textbooks, desperately trying to finish high school exam prep before the holidays truly began. Knock, knock. He dropped his pen, walked to the door, and swung it open. Again, absolute emptiness. Just the cold Scottish air blowing through the threshold. The family quickly chalked it up to a local nuisance. In Scotland, there is an incredibly common, albeit infuriating, game played by bored neighborhood kids known as Chappie, or what others might call Ding Dong Ditch. The premise is simple. Knock on a door, sprint into the darkness, and revel in the adrenaline rush of an angry adult opening a door to an empty porch. It made sense. It was the holidays, kids were out of school, and mischief was in the air. But as the week dragged on, the family group chat began to ping with unsettling updates. Multiple family members were reporting the exact same phenomenon, and the pattern was beginning to fracture the prank theory. The most disturbing incident happened to the father. He was a night owl, the kind of man who stayed up long after the house had surrendered to sleep, sitting in the quiet living room playing Xbox. It was 11:30 p.m. Night. The entire neighborhood was completely dead. All the mischievous kids were long asleep in their beds. The father was staring at the screen when he heard it. It wasn't a loud, boisterous sound designed to provoke a chase. It was a very soft, highly deliberate, quiet knock. Confused and immediately on edge, he walked silently to the front door and pressed his eye against the peephole. Nothing. He slowly, carefully disengaged the lock and pulled the door open just an inch. The street was a ghost town. But no footprints. No giggling from the bushes. He locked the door tight and walked upstairs to wake his wife and ask if she had heard it. She hadn't. The knock had been too quiet, meant only for whoever was standing right on the other side of the wood. The unease in the house began to curdle into genuine paranoia. The hallmark of a child's prank is the sound of retreat, the scuff of sneakers on concrete, the muffled laughter from behind a hedge. But these knocks were clinical. Silent. Whoever was out there was striking the door and vanishing into thin air without making a single sound. Then came Christmas Day. The tension was momentarily forgotten in a flurry of torn wrapping paper, massive feasts, loud laughter, and classic holiday movies. By the time evening rolled around, the narrator had eaten himself into a state of absolute exhaustion. Feeling sick from the massive Christmas dinner, he excused himself, climbed the stairs to his second-floor bedroom, collapsed onto his mattress, and immediately passed out. Visualizing the space is important. The bedrooms were all clustered tightly together on the upper floor, separated from the main living areas by a wooden staircase. Hours later, the narrator's eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand. The glaring digital clock read to white. The house was completely dead. The heavy silence of a winter night pressed against his eardrums. Knowing his internal clock was ruined and that sleep was impossible, he lay in the dark, scrolling mindlessly through social media, watching videos of Christmas presents, and messaging the few friends who were also cursed with insomnia. And then, cutting through the absolute silence of 1 a.m., he heard it. A faint, hollow knock. He froze, his thumb hovering over his glowing phone screen. Where did it come from? Was it the front door downstairs? Was it his bedroom door? Or had the exhaustion finally made him hallucinate? He sat up bolt straight in his bed, his heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He stared into the pitch-black void of his room. The rational part of his brain screamed that absolutely no one should be outside a home at 2 a.m. on Christmas night. But the primal part of his brain, the part that had endured weeks of phantom knocks, was whispering that whoever had been hunting them from the outside had finally found a way in. Because his room was on the second floor, a knock on the exterior window was impossible. Minutes dragged by like hours. Finally, suffocating under the weight of his own fear, he swung his legs out of bed, crept across the floorboards, and grabbed the brass handle of his bedroom door. He turned it slowly, wincing at the tiny click of the latch, and pulled the door open a few inches to peer out into the dark, second-floor hallway. The moment the door opened, his blood turned to ice water. He heard the distinct, heavy sound of footsteps slowly ascending the wooden staircase. His desperate brain immediately searched for a lifeline. It's just Dad, he thought. Dad always stays up late playing Xbox. HES just coming up to bed. He took a step out into the hallway, fully intending to call out a whisper to his father. But as he stepped into the sightline of the staircase, a fresh, terrifying knock echoed through the house. He looked down the stairs. It wasn't his father. Hauling himself up the final few steps was a massive, disheveled man the teenager had never laid eyes on in his life. A wave of pure, paralyzing nausea washed over the 16-year-old. The phantom knocker wasn't outside anymore. He was inside the house. The stranger was heavily, violently intoxicated. He staggered wildly, his heavy boots thudding against the carpet. He reached the top of the landing. Our narrator didn't breathe. He silently, desperately stepped backward, retreating into the blackness of his room, and pulled his door shut until only a millimeter crack remained. He pressed his eye against the gap, his body trembling so violently, he thought his bones would rattle. Through the crack, he watched the nightmare unfold. But the stranger was systematically walking down the hallway, grabbing the handles of the bedroom doors, and pushing them open one by one by one by one. He was checking the rooms. The teenager stood paralyzed. It was a mathematical certainty. In a matter of seconds, the heavy boots would stop outside his door, the handle would turn, and the man would be in the room with him. All his teenage bravado, all his common sense, completely evaporated. He was trapped. He watched the stranger stagger out of his younger sister's bedroom. The sight of this massive intruder standing over where his little sister slept snapped something deep inside the narrator's brain. The paralysis broke. He threw his bedroom door open, sprinting silently down the hall, and exploded into his parents' master bedroom. "There is a man in the house," he hissed, frantically shaking his mother's shoulders. His mother woke instantly, her maternal instincts flooding her system with adrenaline. His father, groggy and confused, struggled to sit up. The mother didn't wait. She bolted out of bed, grabbed her teenage son, and charged down the stairs, ready to face whatever was in her home. They reached the living room. The scene was bizarre and terrifying. The massive stranger was passed out, dead to the world, sprawled awkwardly across their family sofa. Surrounding him on the floor were several of the father's beer bottles, cracked open and half empty. The mother didn't hesitate. She marched up to the sofa and screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding the man get out of her house. The stranger groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at the furious woman, his face twisting into an ugly, drunken scowl. His slurred voice was thick with aggression as he forcefully insisted that this was his house, and they were the intruders. The mother grabbed his shoulder, trying to physically haul him upright, but the man was dead weight. Desperate, she raised her hand and slapped him hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed in the room, but the man barely flinched. Suddenly, heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs. The father had arrived. He took one look at the strange man bleeding alcohol onto his couch, and his paternal rage ignited. He bellowed at the intruder, his voice shaking the walls, threatening him with absolute violence if he didn't leave immediately. The drunk man stubbornly refused, sinking deeper into the cushions. The father didn't ask a second time. He lunged forward, grabbed the massive stranger by the collar of his jacket and the belt of his jeans, and physically deadlifted him off the furniture. Dragging the kicking, swearing man across the carpet, the father hauled him to the side door, violently shoved him out into the freezing Christmas night, and slammed the heavy door shut, locking it tight. The family stood panting in the kitchen. The nightmare was outside. They thought they had one. 3 seconds later, the world exploded. A deafening crash shattered the kitchen. The stranger had driven his bare fist directly through the thick glass of the side door. Shards of jagged glass exploded inward, raining down across the linoleum floor. The family screamed, backing away. And then, in a visual straight out of a horror film, the stranger pushed his bloody, contorted face through the jagged hole in the glass, the sharp edges pressing against his throat. Blood broke from his hands as he screamed through the breach. He roared horrific, violent threats at the terrified family. He swore that he owned this property, that he had memorized all of their faces, and that he would be coming back to finish what he started. The father sprinted for the phone to dial emergency services, while the mother corralled the children backward, away from the screaming, bloody face in their door. Eventually, the alcohol and blood lust took its toll. The man pulled his face from the glass, stumbled backward, and disappeared into the night. When the police arrived, the house was a crime scene. Statements were taken, the narrator giving the longest and most detailed account of the terrifying game of hide-and-seek on the second floor. But finding the intruder didn't require the lead detective work. Because of a rare, heavy snowfall that had blanketed Glasgow that night, the man had left an undeniable map. Trailing away from the shattered back door was a thick, crimson path of blood drops, staining the pristine white snow. The officers simply followed the red trail down the street, around the corner, and directly into a nearby children's playground. They found the massive stranger collapsed in the frozen wood chips, bleeding heavily from deep lacerations in his hands, still clutching shards of the family's window glass. He was arrested on the spot. The aftermath brought answers, but they were deeply unsatisfying. The man was slapped with fines, community service, and a strict restraining order protecting the teenage narrator. During his interrogation, the truth came out. The man had actually lived in that exact house many years prior. He claimed that after a massive Christmas drinking binge, his deeply intoxicated brain had simply reverted to an old muscle memory, leading him to break into his former home, genuinely believing it was still his. But when the detectives pressed him about the weeks leading up to the break-in, the phantom knocks, the quiet tapping at 11:30 p.m., the silent observer on the porch, the man looked him dead in the eye and swore he had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. He adamantly denied ever knocking on their door before that Christmas night. To this day, the family has no explanation. Was the drunken man lying to cover his tracks? Or, far more terrifyingly, was there someone else entirely standing on their porch all those weeks? Even years later, when the house is dark and the Scottish wind howls, the narrator will sometimes hear a faint, hollow knock, and he will lie in bed, paralyzed by the horrific uncertainty of whether it's just the house settling, or if the real phantom is finally asking to come in. We move now from the freezing snow of Scotland to the relentless, heavy rains of the Pacific Northwest. The year was 2010. Our narrator was just 6 years old, living in a cramped duplex in Springfield, Oregon. She lived with her mother, her older brother, and her older sister. Her father, the undeniable protector of the family, was active military and currently deployed overseas. The house felt inherently vulnerable without him, an emptiness that the 6-year-old felt deeply every single day. It was a late, miserable night. The Oregon rain was coming down in thick, rhythmic sheets, drumming a heavy lullaby against the roof. The little girl and her mother were sitting out on the covered front porch. The mother was quietly smoking a cigarette, wrapped in a sweater, while the 6-year-old just enjoyed the cold, damp air and the rare, quiet moment of connection. The street was entirely desolate. Not a car, not a stray dog, just the sound of the rain. And then, a figure emerged from the gloom. Walking dead center down the middle of the asphalt road was a man. The streetlight had caught the harsh, synthetic yellow of an oversized, heavy-duty rain jacket. The hood was pulled up, completely obscuring his face. The sight instantly triggered an alarm bell in the mother's head. No one took a midnight stroll in the middle of a torrential downpour, unless something was deeply wrong. Mother and daughter froze on the porch, their eyes locked on the approaching figure. The man in the yellow coat didn't stay in the road. He suddenly pivoted, his heavy boots splashing through the puddles, and began marching directly toward their driveway. He didn't walk to the porch. He stopped abruptly at the edge of their property, standing perfectly still next to their plastic garbage cans. The mother didn't wait to see what he wanted. She dropped her cigarette, crushed it under her heel, grabbed her 6-year-old daughter by the wrist with terrifying strength, and began to pull her toward the front door. The sudden movement broke the man's silence. He threw his head back and began violently, aggressively screaming at them through the rain. To a 6-year-old, the words were just a chaotic, terrifying noise. But the sheer, unhinged aggression in his voice was unmistakable. He was furious. The mother practically threw her daughter through the threshold, slammed the heavy front door, and aggressively threw the deadbolt. She didn't stop there. She frantically sprinted from room to room, killing every single light switch until the duplex was plunged into absolute darkness. The terror was infectious. The 6-year-old burst into hysterical tears. Her mother fiercely shushed her, grabbing her older siblings from their rooms, and herded all 3 children into the master bedroom. They piled into the massive king-sized bed, a knot of terrified bodies hiding in the dark, listening to the rain beat against the siding, praying the screaming man would walk away. Eventually, the adrenaline faded, and exhaustion dragged the family into a fitful sleep. But sleep offered no sanctuary for the 6-year-old. Her mind conjured a horrific nightmare. In her dream, the man in the oversized yellow raincoat was pressed flat against her bedroom window, his hidden face staring through the glass directly at her sleeping body. She woke up screaming, tears streaming down her face, her tiny body violently shaking. She scrambled across the mattress and frantically shook her older sister awake, desperately needing comfort. Her older sister, bleary-eyed but protective, dragged herself out of bed. She took her little sister by the hand and guided her into the master bathroom attached to the bedroom, softly shutting the door behind them so they wouldn't wake their exhausted mother and brother. The older sister knelt on the tile floor, whispering soothing words, trying to calm the 6-year-old's frantic sobbing. And then, the nightmare broke through the walls. Bang! 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 A massive, deafening pounding erupted from the front door of the duplex. Someone was hitting the wood with the force of a sledgehammer. The older sister's eyes went wide with absolute terror. She abandoned the bathroom, sprinting into the bedroom, and began violently shaking their sleeping mother. The sheer volume of the assault on the front door shocked the older brother awake as well. The 6-year-old remained paralyzed on the cold bathroom tile, her hands clamped over her ears. Her mother rushed back to the bathroom, her face pale in the dim light, and frantically motioned for her older son and daughter to join the youngest inside. It was a makeshift panic room. The 3 children huddled together on the floor, weeping hysterically, as they watched their mother creep out of the master bedroom and slowly make her way down the dark hallway toward the front door. The pounding wasn't stopping. It was growing more frantic, accompanied by the muffled, guttural screams of a man demanding to be let inside. The children waited for the sound of their mother, calling the police. They waited for the blue lights, but nothing happened. When their mother finally crept back into the bathroom, her expression was one of absolute, suffocating despair. She had torn the house apart looking for her old BlackBerry phone, the only communication device in the entire house, and she couldn't find it. They were completely cut off from the outside world. There was no phone. There were no police coming, and their father, their protector, was an ocean away. It is vital to understand the architecture of this terror. This was a duplex. They shared a physical, interior wall with their neighbors. The houses in the neighborhood were packed tightly together. As the mother and her 3 children sat huddled on the bathroom floor, sobbing and shaking while a maniac screamed and tried to shatter their front door, they waited desperately for a neighbor to hear the chaos and dial 911. The noise was deafening. Surely, the people sleeping just inches away on the other side of the drywall could hear the assault. But the walls remained silent. No one came to their rescue. No one called for help. They endured an agonizing, endless siege entirely on their own. Eventually, the banging slowed, the screaming faded. The man in the yellow raincoat finally surrendered to the night and vanished. The family survived the night, but the psychological damage was permanent. They tried to resume a normal life, desperately trying to forget the trauma of being so utterly abandoned. A few weeks passed. The terror began to fade into a dark memory. And then one morning, the family woke up to a freezing draft blowing through the duplex. The mother walked into the living room and screamed. The heavy front door was standing wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. She rushed to the windows. White. One of the heavy window screens had been violently sliced open, a massive, jagged hole cut directly through the mesh. The lock had been forced. Someone had been inside their home while they slept. The mother finally found her phone and dialed the police, but the violation was already complete. The intruder had taken a bizarre, deeply unsettling collection of items. Random household objects were missing. The 6-year-old's porcelain piggy bank, heavy with holiday savings, had been stolen right from her bedroom. But the most horrifying theft was a massive, heavy glass vase that the family used to stash their excess cash and coins. They had been filling it for months. It wasn't the loss of the money that chilled the family to the bone. It was the location of the vase. The heavy glass vase had been sitting on the nightstand right next to the bed where the mother and her children were sleeping. While they lay unconscious in the dark, breathing softly, an intruder had stood silently in their bedroom, hovering over their sleeping bodies, close enough to reach out and touch them, just to steal a jar of coins. The police took a report that the trail was cold. The intruder was never caught. To this day, the narrator, now an adult, wrestles with the horrific puzzle pieces. Like, was the break-in committed by the screaming man in the yellow raincoat? Or was it a terrifying coincidence? The screaming man was violently aggressive, while the burglar was a silent, creeping phantom. But the most disturbing piece of the puzzle presented itself months later. The narrator was walking through her tightly packed neighborhood when she glanced at the porch of a reclusive, older male neighbor, a man they rarely saw and never spoke to. Sitting casually on his front porch, acting as a makeshift planter, was a massive glass vase that looked identical to the one stolen from her bedroom nightstand. Who do you trust when the monster pounding on your door might be the very same person you pray will call the police? For our final story, we travel to the desolate, rural expanse of Idaho. Our narrator was a young man serving a full-time religious mission, paired with a companion he refers to as Spencer. They were stationed in a tiny, mapped-out town where the isolation was absolute. At the time, our narrator was struggling. He was battling severe self-esteem issues and crippling insomnia, plunging him into a dark, vulnerable headspace. Because of his mental exhaustion, he and Spencer often found it impossible to stay out proselytizing all day. They sought refuge in their assigned housing. Unlike the typical cramped apartment complexes assigned to missionaries, they had been given a freestanding house. But calling it a house was generous. It was a tiny, fragile box sitting in the middle of nowhere. The layout was a masterclass in claustrophobia. You walked through the front door directly into the main living room, which doubled as their office. Immediately to the right was the single bedroom. Straight ahead, an open archway led into a small kitchen. Branching off the kitchen was a bathroom on the right, and a laundry room on the left. That was the entirety of their world. Every single room had a window facing out into the dark, rural landscape. Their only lifeline was the property landlord, who lived in a larger house situated on the plot next door. It was a freezing winter night. The sun had dropped below the horizon hours ago, plunging the Idaho landscape into an impenetrable, ink-black darkness. The two young men were trying to decompress. The narrator was sitting at his desk in the living room, his chair swiveled around to face the dark archway of the kitchen. Spencer was in the bedroom, scrolling through his phone in the quiet. The house was completely silent. Tap, tap. A single, distinct knock echoed from the back of the house. The narrator froze, his eyes darting toward the kitchen. The sound had come perfectly from the window positioned directly above the kitchen sink. Because of the tiny footprint of the house, he had a clear line of sight directly to that window. He stared at the glass. It was a black mirror reflecting the dim interior lights. There was absolutely nothing outside but the dark. His desperate, anxious brain immediately generated a rationalization. It's just a tree branch. The wind blew a heavy branch against the glass. He knew there were massive trees lined up behind the property. But as he tried to return to his phone, the logic crumbled. The trees were set far back from the foundation. None of their branches could physically reach the kitchen window. And a branch scraping glass produces a horrific, screeching sound. Like, this wasn't a scrape. Like, this was the dull, heavy thud of human knuckles striking a pane of glass. Before he could process the terror, the silence was broken again. Tap. This time, the sound didn't come from the kitchen. It came from around the corner, from the window inside the laundry room. The horrifying reality snapped into focus. Someone was out there in the freezing dark, and they were walking the perimeter of the tiny house, methodically testing every single window. Panic seized his chest. He stood up, intending to sprint to the bedroom and warn Spencer. He opened his mouth to shout, "Tap." He violently flinched. The third knock hadn't come from the back of the house. It came from the living room window, the glass located just a few feet to his immediate left. The intruder had circled all the way around to the front. The narrator didn't look at the glass. He knew if he turned his head, he would be staring directly into the face of a predator, separated only by a quarter-inch of fragile glass. He bolted. He dove into the bedroom, slamming the wooden door shut behind him and wildly throwing the lock. Spencer looked up, startled. "Did you hear that?" The narrator gasped, his chest heaving. Spencer nodded, his face drained of color. "Yeah, I heard it." The two young men stood trapped in the tiny bedroom, frantically debating their options. Like, they were miles from civilization. Their only weapons were a couple of dull kitchen knives sitting uselessly on the counter in the other room. They had no idea if the person circling the house was a lone psychopath, or a group of armed men waiting to rush the doors. Stepping outside to confront them was tantamount to suicide. And then, the psychological torture escalated. The knocking moved away from the windows. Heavy, rhythmic pounding began to echo from the solid wood of the front door. They were under siege. Calling the rural police was a desperate gamble. A patrol car could take 30 minutes to navigate the dark country roads. Spencer grabbed his phone. "Wait. The landlord," he hissed. He dialed the number of the man living next door, praying he was awake. As Spencer rapidly whispered the situation to the landlord, the pounding at the front door suddenly ceased. The silence that followed was heavier and far more terrifying than the noise did before that night. The narrator stared at the drawn blinds of their bedroom window. He knew exactly what the silence meant. Tap, tap. The sound vibrated through the bedroom wall. The intruder had finally reached their sanctuary. Even though the blinds were tightly drawn, shielding them from view. The psychological horror of knowing a predator was standing mere inches from where they slept was suffocating. Through the phone, the landlord's voice cut through the panic. "I'm grabbing my shotgun. I'm coming out now." The two missionaries stood frozen in the center of the bedroom, barely daring to breathe, waiting for the sound of shattering glass. Mike. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, a booming, familiar voice shouted from the front porch. It was the landlord. They practically tore the bedroom door off its hinges, sprinted through the living room, and threw open the front door. The landlord stood on the porch, a heavy pump-action shotgun gripped tightly in his hands, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Did you see him?" Spencer gasped. The landlord shook his head, his jaw tight. "No. But as I was walking out my back door, I saw a dark pickup truck tear out of the driveway and speed down the road. They killed their headlights. I couldn't catch a plate." Armed with heavy-duty flashlights and flanked by the landlord's shotgun, the two young men stepped out into the freezing Idaho night to inspect the perimeter. A winter storm had rolled through days prior, leaving scattered, crusty patches of snow across the frozen dirt. The sweeping beams of their flashlights quickly revealed the terrifying truth of their ordeal. Imprinted deeply into the snow patches was a single set of heavy boot prints. The flashlight beams tracked the footprints as they moved methodically from the kitchen window, stepping around the foundation to the laundry room, circling to the living room, pausing heavily at the front door, and finally stamping the snow directly beneath their bedroom window. There was only one man, and he had hunted them perfectly. They debated calling the police, but the brutal reality of rural law enforcement set in. With no license plate, no description of the driver, and hours of dark highways to escape down, filing a report was an exercise in futility. The landlord promised to keep his shotgun loaded by his bed, and told them to call the absolute second the man returned. They locked the house down, wedged chairs under the doorknobs, and collapsed into their beds. But sleep never came. The narrator lay awake, his mind spiraling through a terrifying logical deduction. It wasn't a prank by fellow missionaries. They were miles away and subject to strict curfews. It wasn't local teenagers. Teenagers travel in packs, and they would have laughed or thrown rocks, not systematically tested the glass in absolute silence. No one ever confessed. The identity of the man in the pickup truck remains a complete mystery. But the detail that haunts the narrator to this very day, the thought that exacerbates his insomnia and forces him to sleep with the lights on, isn't the sound of the knocking. It's the realization of what happened during that very first knock. When he heard that tap on the kitchen window, he had turned his chair and stared directly at the glass. He had seen nothing but his own reflection in the dark. But the footprints in the snow proved that a man had been standing right there, his face pressed to the glass, looking into the brightly lit house. The intruder could see everything. The narrator had looked directly into the eyes of a predator, separated by a thin pane of glass. And he hadn't even known the monster was there. Thank you for listening, friends. The next time the sun goes down, double-check your locks. Pull your curtains tight. And if you hear a quiet, unexpected knock when the world should be asleep, but do not open the door. Stay safe out there in the dark.